Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about Troika Games and Kickstarter. No, Kickstarter did not exist when Troika was there, but someone asked a question on the channel. I think it's been asked multiple times. It's also something I've thought about a lot. It's something I've actually discussed a little bit. I know I had this discussion with Leonard. I talked about it with a couple other designers at Obsidian when I was there. But let's dive into it. NU4ED, I don't know how to pronounce that, asks, if Kickstarter had been a thing while Troika was alive, would you have tried to crowdfund? And if yes, what? So I will give you the answers as briefly as I can, and then I'll dive into it. Yes, and Arcanum 2. So, yes, if crowdfunding had existed, Troika definitely would have gone that path. Troika was a very small company. When we made Arcanum, we were 14 people, and because of that, we were very efficient. People wore lots of different hats, which you don't see these days. We had people doing programming who were also doing design. We had designers who were doing art. We had artists who were doing scripting. We had people doing business work, everything from ordering supplies to interacting with the publisher to handling the office, the landlord, and handling things around the office. We did all of that, plus we made a game. So Troika was the perfect game to handle the efficiency that you need for a Kickstarter budget. When people say, well, you could raise millions of dollars. Yeah, but it costs millions of dollars to make a game. And you better get it right because there's no going back to that well. Unlike a publisher, where if you run out of money and you're like, hey, I just need another milestone to finish, you can't do that with Kickstarter. But I think Troika was small enough that had we gotten a budget like that and made for the budget, and we had learned, I think with Fallout and Arcanum, we had learned better about staying in a budget. I know Bloodlines kind of shows that isn't true, but we stayed within the budget for Temple, and we gave more than what was asked for and more than what we probably should. But anyway, wouldn't have gone with Bloodlines. I wouldn't have gone with Temple. What I would have made is Arcanum 2. I've already talked about what I want for a sequel for that. I'll link it below. But that journey to the center of Arcanum, maybe we would have done that. If it was a Kickstarter game, maybe we wouldn't. I mean, we would have certainly asked what people would want. Did you want another game using the same engine? Would you want us to go first person because Source was then a big thing and it was available, and the person who had signed us for Sierra now worked over at Valve. So there's a bunch of things that we could have done there. But one of the reasons I pick Arcanum for a sequel is we had way more stories to tell. Way more. We barely scratched the surface of a fantasy world undergoing an industrial revolution. And part of the reason we didn't tell those stories is you can add side content to a game, and we added a lot of side content to Arcanum. But eventually you have to tell the story you set out to tell, which was who was that mysterious gnome in the blimp crash, and why is this leading to a dangerous villain returning to the world of Arcanum? But we still had way more stories to tell. I wanted to talk about different elven clans besides the ones you met, different dwarven clans. Wanted to dive way more into what was going on with orcs in various places, because we talked about orcs in cities. What about orcs that lived out in the wilderness? What about ogres? What about that whole half-ogre storyline? Now, that's a good example, though, of why, if we go Kickstarter, that would probably be better, because it was hard enough telling some of our stories back then without being censored. In fact, about that time, putting in anything that was even vaguely homosexual was censored. But these days, I doubt if we'd be able to tell many of the stories from Arcanum in a game, because people would be like, no, you don't want to talk about that. Or half the reason we created Arcanum, not half, but a big chunk of Arcanum was, here are all these different races, real races, not like we have in our world. But here are people who are literally different genetic humanoids. We had gnomes, we had orcs, we had elves, we had dwarves and humans. And there was a bunch of racist stuff going on, and we addressed it. We tried to address what would happen. Things that seemed okay in a fantasy world, but that doesn't fly in a modern industrialized world. Those were issues that were facing the world of Arcanum, and we wanted to tell stories about that because it reflects stories in the real world. But people don't want that now. People want you to pretend like nothing's bad, nothing's going on. The whole there's a problem here, but let's not talk about it. If we don't talk about it, it won't be a problem, or it will go away. And that's not what we were trying to do in Arcanum. We were trying to tell a lot of different stories, and there were so many different stories that if it was something you weren't interested in, you didn't have to follow that gnome half ogre plot. You didn't have to follow that. You didn't have to dive too deep on what was happening to dwarf clans. You didn't have to dive too deep on dark elves, what was going on with those clans. But those are things I would love to have told if we'd had a Kickstarter. I think, too, Kickstarter provided a better communication channel between the fans, who are now literally your stakeholders. They're paying you to do this, and the developer. So doing an early beta and getting feedback on it, way easier with a Kickstarter, especially because you can get feedback from people who you know paid. In fact, that's something that's going on this channel. There's so much feedback on this channel. I'm still reading all the comments, but it takes a lot of time just to do that. Trying to answer them and then trying to make videos based on them. I've already got a month of videos in the queue. It's really hard to do. One of the things that YouTube has suggested several times is that I throw memberships onto the channel where people pay something like $1.99, and then they have a little icon next to their name, but they give me tools to let me prioritize. Those are the comments I want to read first. So it would provide a way of me getting feedback from people who are a little more vested in this channel than people who are just doing drive-bys. You know, they saw the video, they watched part of it, they understood a quarter of it, and then they leave a comment, and I'm like sitting there trying to understand, is this comment a joke? Are they being sarcastic? Did they really mean it? Did they really understand what I was trying to say? The wonderful thing about Kickstarter is you can put forums that only people who donate can get into. Maybe you can even kick it up and saying you have to donate a significant amount before you can get into this forum. You can give the beta to everybody, but you can make a feedback for the people who have a greater stake in the game. And these are people who you would like to think, if you're paying money for something, you care about how good it is. So we'd get better feedback. I think right there, that would be a nice self-selection filter for getting good feedback from people. But I had another reason, by the way, a very personal reason for why I'd rather do Arcanum than Temple or Bloodlines if we had ever kickstarted Troika Game. And that's because I really liked working on Arcanum, especially having coming from Fallout, where there was a lot of pressures that people on the team didn't have to experience, but I did. Because interestingly, when I talked to Leonard liked Fallout, working on Fallout better than Arcanum. We're not talking about the end product, we're talking about the actual development process. He says he liked Fallout better than Arcanum. And I think it's because he didn't deal with a lot of the stuff having to do with Fallout. I did. I was the one that was dealing with all the production issues and deadlines and arguments that were coming in from above. He didn't have to deal with any of that, but he did on Arcanum. And so suddenly he's like, I don't like the Arcanum process very much. To me, Arcanum was a lot less pressure. It felt calmer. It felt like more of our ideas were going into the game with less discussion with higher up people. I like that. I would love to do that again. A Kickstarter, if Kickstarter had existed back at Troika, we certainly would have kickstarted Arcanum 2. And maybe it would have been Journey to the Center of Arcanum. Maybe it would have been an isometric game set on a different continent, or a different story told on that continent we had, since we already had established a lot of NPCs and a lot of cool areas. Couldn't say. I mean, yeah, Kickstarter didn't happen until all over 10 years after Arcanum. Arcanum shipped in 2001. I think we Kickstarted in 2012. So it seems like it's a bigger gap, but it's not that big. But basically, Kickstarter came 10 years too late for Troika. Anyway, new for Ed. I hope that answers your question.